who was the future founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. When we think about this freedom movement, it's going to stretch from New York City to the industrial shop floors of Detroit, Michigan, to Dixie's Cradle of Birmingham, Alabama, out west to the post-industrial, or really post-war boom towns of Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Now, two words are going to transform this movement, and those words are Cold War. The Cold War is really a hard peace through the threat of global nuclear warfare. By the late 1940s, some of the most famous advocates for democracy, including W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, are going to be smeared really unfairly as communists. Robeson's passport is going to be revoked. Du Bois is going to undergo a sham trial where the charges are eventually going to be thrown out, but tried as a traitor. And when we want to understand civil rights and black power, we really need to look at the Cold War. Because what the Cold War does is really impact a radical movement for civil rights that had sprung up in the 1930s and 1940s. It's going to curtail that movement. By the 1950s, we're going to see a civil rights movement that is Southern-based, that's not national in orientation, and really that is fearful of talking about anti-colonialism, is fearful about talking about economic equality, it's fearful about talking about the end of Jim Crow in every facet of American society, because it's fearful of being red-baited or being smeared as communists. Now, this is an interesting segue when we think about the early 1950s to talk about Malcolm X. We usually only talk about Malcolm in the 1960s, but Malcolm's important to having a holistic understanding of black power. Malcolm X is on the fringes of the post-war freedom surge that I was discussing of the 1930s and 40s. During those years, he's a hustler, he's a thief, right? He's going to spend 6 years in Charlestown, Massachusetts, between 1946 and 1952 for crimes that he did commit. It's not a political prisoner. Enters jail in 1946. By the late 1940s, he undergoes a personal, religious, and political transformation. He's going to be released from prison in 1952. He's going to go to Detroit, work in a furniture factory. By 1954, the same year as that Brown Supreme Court desegregation decision, Malcolm is going to enter Harlem and become the minister of the Muslim Mosque number 7 on West 116th Street. What's important about this is that when we look at Malcolm's political career between 1954 and 1965, what we're going to see is that Malcolm is the leader of a narrow or sectarian religious group that even in the early 1950s, he's trying to turn into a cosmopolitan and national political organization. And that's why those two are going to part by the early 1960s. What's interesting with Malcolm is that Malcolm X is really attempting to confront American democracy's jagged edges of institutional racism, police brutality, unemployment, lack of self-discipline, a lack of self-determination, not just among black Harlemites, but among black folks all across the country. Malcolm's also going to create alliances. He's going to create alliances with people who are not part of the Nation of Islam. This includes activists in Detroit who are Christians, like the Reverend Albert Clay Jr. It includes radical Marxists and socialists, Grace and James Lee Watts. It includes politicians like the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. of Harlem. So when we look at Malcolm, we see that Malcolm is creating extraordinary alliances in the 1950s. Some of these alliances actually intersect with civil rights activism. When we think about how did Malcolm feel about civil rights activism, well, I argue in Wait Until the Midnight Hour that he's both repulsed and inspired by the heroic period of the civil rights movement. And what I mean by repulsed is that Malcolm's notion of self-determination and self-defense and the Nation of Islam's very patriarchal notion of protecting black women and children, right? Every instance of spectacular violence against black Americans in the South really stokes a fire in Malcolm. He's saying, why is this happening? Why won't Dr. King and the other civil rights workers protect black people, right? But at the same time, Malcolm's inspired by the young people and the vitality of organizers who are sitting in and who are putting, in the lingua franca of the time, their bodies on the line for democracy. So we think about Malcolm between 54 and 65, and we'll talk about him more in the questions and answers. Malcolm is a pivotal figure, and not just the polar opposite of Dr. King. He's a pivotal figure for a black power ideology that talks about self-determination, that connects anti-racist struggles at the domestic level with anti-colonial struggles at the international level, very much influenced by the 1955 Bandung Conference in Indonesia, very much influenced by Ghana and Ghanaian independence in 1957, very much influenced by Cuba and the Cuban Revolution in 1959. When Fidel Castro comes to Harlem in 1960, the first black leader he meets with is Malcolm X in September of 1960 at the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street in Harlem. It's very, very important. When we think about 1961, this black power movement, this early black power movement that I'm discussing, its first appearance is going to be on February 15, 1961, as a national movement when 70 activists, including Leroy Jones and Maya Angelou, protest against the assassination of Patrice Lumumba at the United Nations Security Council. And they're protesting against Lumumba's assassination because Lumumba was the 36-year-old democratically elected prime minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and he had just been recently assassinated. When we think about this black power movement between 54 and 65, this early black power movement, it's going to crisscross and intersect with civil rights. I'll give one example. June 23rd, 1963, there's going to be a massive demonstration in Detroit, Michigan. 125,000 people are going to come out, sympathy demonstration for what's going on in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to give the keynote, and this march is going to be organized by Malcolm X's allies in Detroit, the Reverend Albert Clegg Jr. I want to talk about Stokely Carmichael. I know I'm running out of time. When we think about 1966 to 1975, this is the classical period of the Black Power period. And I want to talk about Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers and sort of wrap this up. Stokely Carmichael, who I'm writing a biography of as we speak, is really one of the most important political figures of the post-war period. By post-war, I mean after 1945 in the 20th century. Carmichael is a civil rights militant turned black power revolutionary. He's born in Port of Spain, Trinidad in 1941, moves to the Bronx in 1952. He's one of the only African-American students to test into Bronx Science High School in 1956. And I'll repeat that. One of the only black students to test into Bronx Science High School. So Stokely Carmichael is brilliant. There's no affirmative action. There's no helping hand. He tests into Bronx Science High School in 1956. Graduates from Bronx Science in 1960. He enrolls at Howard University when revolutions are whirling from Birmingham to Bandung, from Haiti to Harlem, from New Orleans to Nigeria. Between 1960 and 1966, Carmichael was one of the few Americans of any color who bleeds for democracy domestically. What I mean by bleeding for democracy is that Carmichael was arrested 27 times between 1960 and 1966 for civil rights activists in Washington, D.C., in Cambridge, Maryland, in the Mississippi Delta, in Lowndes County, Alabama. Carmichael is going to argue that democracy's best face is etched in the visages and the creases and crevices of sharecroppers, poor, illiterate, semi-literate, in places like